Shana Tova. Last night, as we were finishing our Erev Rosh Hashanah service, I received the painful news that we all did last night, that Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died. As we sat down for that service and Jews across the country sat down for dinner last night, we entered this year in grief, a specific kind of grief, mourning Justice Ginsburg. RBG played an outsized role for us as Jews and as Americans committed to justice. A lioness of the law, as some would call her, she was revered by legal experts and lay people from both sides of the political spectrum for her brilliance and the trail she blazed for female attorneys and jurists. And she was a passionate Jew, inspired by the fact that, in her words, the demand for justice, for peace, and for enlightenment runs through the entirety of Jewish history and Jewish tradition. She then said, "I hope all the years I have the good fortune to continue serving on the bench of the Supreme Court, I will have the strength and courage to remain steadfast in the service of that demand." No matter your politics, all of us can recognize that RBG did exactly that up until yesterday. And as we move into a new year, her passing has intensified the anxiety that some of us have felt for years. She was like the last stand, a constitutional bulwark against anti-democratic forces in our government that we most feared. Those of us who shared her political worldview especially valued the decisions she made on the Supreme Court. RBG spent her life judging cases, determining what is right and wrong. She had a unique kind of wisdom, which is a kind of wisdom that's been lacking for most of us these days, not just in Washington, but for all of us. 5780 was a year defined by decisions. That's true of every year, but this past year, the choices we made felt even more challenging than they normally would. And most of us don't come naturally to the innate discernment that Ruth Bader Ginsburg espoused. Since we've endured this pandemic over the past 6 months, each of us has been faced with seemingly impossible decisions that would have been no-brainers at Rosh Hashanah last year. Every choice has felt consequential, even choices that are somewhat more mundane than those before the Supreme Court. Should I go to the grocery store? Is it safe to eat at a restaurant? Is it ethical to see my friends? Especially in the springtime, many of us were paralyzed by decisions as basic as these ones, to say nothing of the decisions that were far greater and would feel existential in any year. As your rabbi, I don't really know how to answer many of the questions that have emerged during this time. I've been moved by how many of you have come to me for guidance. If you should leave New York temporarily or forever, if you should quit your job and go back to school or start a new job altogether, if you should move to a cheaper apartment, end a relationship, or enter into one. These were always the options on the table, but we are in this moment plagued by indecision. That extends to every rabbi I know. And it appears that even the leaders whom we elected to the highest office of power are as confused as we are, which is unsettling. At the end of her life, Justice Ginsburg noted this and commented frequently on how distressed she was by the erratic behavior of the men currently in power. RBG was one of the few people in public life in America today to demonstrate what Judaism lifts up as 3 basic requirements for leadership: wisdom, discernment, and knowledge. Or in Hebrew, chokhmah, bina, and da'at. As an aside, the word Chabad is an acronym for chokhmah, bina, and da'at, and I'll let you decide if you think Chabadniks are the arbiters of all 3. But while all these things are essential, one of these attributes is actually harder to find than the other 2. When Moses sets out to appoint tribal heads to help him guide the Israelites, he asks each tribe to find chachamim unbonim viduim, people who are wise, discerning, and learned. But 2 verses later, we learn that the tribesmen only find chachamim viduim, men who are wise and learned, not discerning. Following a midrash, the 13th century sage Hizkuni suggests Moses just couldn't find anyone who was discerning in that moment. His was a generation stuck in the wilderness, and no one knew which way to go. Among the different types of intelligence, alongside chokhmah or wisdom and da'at from knowledge, bina is the specific kind of intelligence that comes from distinguishing between things. The Hebrew preposition bain, meaning between, actually comes from the same root as bina, suggesting that bina is the ability to choose a right path between multiple options. Bina is always harder to find than chokhmah or da'at, but for us in 2020, the ability to discern between multiple options seems all the more elusive. Unfortunately, in this moment when decisions seem impossible to make, the stakes could really not be much higher. We look out at the world and things are bad. It was bad when we sat here last year as our nation declined toward authoritarianism. Black people were murdered in broad daylight. Kids were put in cages, and in our own borough, Jews were attacked for being visibly Jewish at alarming rates. But now, as a pandemic has claimed 200,000 American lives and laid bare the racial and economic inequities of our society, it's even worse. There's no way we were going to enter 5781 as a community without acknowledging that basic fact. The West Coast is on fire, our democracy is gravely threatened, and still, there is no telling when this pandemic will end. I can't stop thinking about the words from the book of Judges. Bayamim hahem ein melech b'Yisrael. In those days, there was no king in Israel. In today's America, it often feels that way, like there's no one in charge as things spiral downward. Certainly no one who has the bina we need right now. There's only one figure that the Torah describes explicitly as having bina, a relatively minor character in popular memory, but one with a singular role, Bezalel, the craftsman of the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary that the Israelites took wherever they went. God singles out Bezalel to perform this sacred task and imbues him with all three of the requisite forms of intelligence, including Binah. In the Talmud, in Tractate Brachot 55, we read that when God selects Bezalel, God asks Moses to tell him to make a sanctuary, an ark, and vessels through which the people can encounter the divine. When Moses goes to Bezalel, he reverses the order and tells him to make vessels, an ark, and a sanctuary. At which point Bezalel explains to him why this doesn't make any sense. Moses, he says, the standard practice is that a person builds a house and only afterward places vessels in it. Perhaps you got the order mixed up. And immediately Moses understands that he was wrong. If only it were always so easy to speak truth to power and have power listen back. Bezalel is not a military leader. He's not a scholar. He's not even necessarily that charismatic. His role is to create. And through his creative lens, he's able to see a path forward. In this Talmudic scenario, a lowly, oft-forgotten artist stands up to the Torah's greatest leader and helps him realize the proper order of things. Which reminds us that when our leaders themselves don't know or do the right thing, those of us with any understanding at all need to do our part to direct them. Fine. Okay, Bezalel had binah. He knew the right thing to do and spoke truth to power. We want to do that. We want to have that same insight in our own lives with a little more clarity than we currently have about what to do and which decisions are the right ones. And this is where Rosh Hashanah comes in. Conveniently for us, the high holidays are perhaps our tradition's most important exercise in building and achieving binah. As opposed to focusing on the other forms of intelligence, which we might do in yeshiva or in religious school, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are all about attaining a level of discernment, of binah, that we may not have previously had. In a moment, we'll encounter the calculus of the high holidays with the iconic words of Unatana Tokef. On Rosh Hashanah, the book of life is opened, and on Yom Kippur, it is sealed. According to Maimonides, when Rosh Hashanah comes along, the names of purely righteous people are immediately sealed in the book of life without having to wait for Yom Kippur. But for almost all human beings, who are neither purely righteous nor purely wicked. Maimonides says that our names are not sealed in the book of life until Yom Kippur, because during the next week, we get a chance to make an intention to do better in the year to come. We commit to doing an accounting of our souls, diving as deep within ourselves as possible during this time as a way of tipping the balance in our favor so that we may be remembered in the book of life. And the Hebrew word that Maimonides uses to describe us imperfect souls in this liminal space between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is Beinonim, people in between, from the very same root as Binah. When we ask who shall live and who shall die, we acknowledge during this season that we are between two poles, between life and death, between good and evil, between comfort and affliction. And as we become self-consciously Beinonim, suspended in between all of these poles, we are commanded to engage in three things as a way of moving forward: tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah. By doing the work of looking inward, tshuva, by falling upon ourselves, tefillah, and by giving of ourselves honestly, tzedakah, we move from being Beinoni to having binah. We move from being in between choices to knowing the right choice to make. Obviously, it won't give us all the answers we need, but doing the soul searching that this week demands is the only way for us to get closer to any answers about what to do in the coming year. The answers themselves won't come from God. Rather, our tradition teaches that for us to reach a level of discernment in our personal lives and probably also for our country, and the only way we're going to meaningfully push our leadership in the right direction is to take this process of tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah as seriously as possible. We're encountering these holidays in a way that is obviously bizarre and imperfect, but our need to take this moment seriously might be even greater than in years past. We're here at services today to kick off a full week of searching deep within ourselves for answers about how to be in the world, which is especially resonant as we end a year when there were so many decisions we weren't sure how to make. If we've been a little more anxious than usual in the past year, if we've been overwhelmed by the mantle of decision-making, let's let ourselves off the hook a little bit. We are not Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the decisions we will make in the year to come will likely be somewhat less nationally significant than the ones that she made during her career. But as we mourn RBG this Rosh Hashanah, and we consider her legacy, may we also admire the extent to which she honed her binah, her ability to discern, throughout her life. May we be inspired by her life story, enduring challenging moments both personally and societally from which she learned. And as we move throughout these holidays, may we find insights from within ourselves that surprise us and help us move into a new year with greater confidence that we are doing the right thing. Shana Tova.